Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 14, When Praying Alone is Not Enough. In this episode, I want to explore some circumstances in which prayer alone is not a sufficient response. It's important that as we build a life of prayer, that we don't give into the sentimental or magical ways of thinking about prayer that I think really are kind of in the air, that you hear sorts of things about a lot. And they bill it as a cure-all, as a way out of all of life's problems, as a sort of replacement spirituality. In other words, like you, instead of dealing in and wrestling with the problems themselves, you escape into prayer, and there you rely only on God to work things out. And there is something that sounds really spiritual about that, and perhaps there is a means of understanding faith that can come through that line of thought. However, I do think that while prayer is an important and indeed vital way of connecting to God, it's not the whole of the spiritual life. And when you portray it as such, it really misrepresents, I think, the nature of prayer. Prayer must be accompanied by other practices and disciplines. It must be folded into the life of the spiritual person. It's accompanied by wise and bold action. See, a life of prayer that is separated from action, that's separated from any other kind of engagement with what's happening in the world or with your own life, it seems to me to really represent the same sort of thing as the idea of faith without deeds that James warns against in the Scriptures. And he ends up comparing that to a body without the Spirit. And I think that's a great metaphor for thinking about what prayer becomes when we distance it, when we separate it from the rest of our lives. Prayer that is only prayer can become a way of having a spirituality that is very dualistic, okay? So you have your spirituality, then you have your regular life, and those things aren't really interconnected together. And what happens then is that the spirituality begins to die. And not only that, but the things that are happening in the physical world begin to, as they're distanced from the life of the Spirit, from the life of prayer, they too begin to die and decay too. So, learning to be a person of prayer then means in part coming to understand the limits of prayer, or that sounds bad, but maybe more accurately we could say those places where prayer engages with our lives in such a way that it connects us or causes us to act beyond the prayers themselves. Our lives become connected to what's happening in our prayers. And I think it's really important to think about that, to think about not just how we come into prayer, bringing everything that has happened to us in the physical world, and we bring those things to the Lord in prayer honestly. But it's also true that sometimes our prayers must move us towards action, that move us out. As we enter into and come from prayer, we are always experiencing this dialogue between our physical and material selves. And those things are becoming more and more tightly integrated together if we pray well. Okay? They're not becoming more and more separated. We're becoming more whole as a person, not more fractured. So instead of just talking about this in that abstract sort of way, though, I want to offer 3 specific examples of places where prayer is important, but by praying alone isn't really a wise course of action. It's not sufficient. It's not really enough. Okay, and I think that'll provide some color and some clarity to what I'm trying to say here. Okay, so the first one is prayer is not enough when you need to reconcile with someone. You know, Jesus talks in the Sermon on the Mount about what it means to be angry with your brother and to have some kind of conflict with a person, and then you're on your way to worship, and there that conflict comes to your mind. You have to go and you reconcile then on the spot instead of just going through the motions of worship. And I think the same thing's true of prayer, right? Like when you have something that's such a high conflict of or a high degree of conflict with someone, and that it really demands reconciliation. It demands you and that person coming together. And that kind of situation, to me, obviously you want to take that to the Lord in prayer. You want to pray about what it means to reconcile with that person. But at some point, you have to go reconcile with that person. You have to go talk to the other person or somehow communicate with them. And sometimes I think like a written form is a good way of jumping into that. But whatever it is that you got to do, you got to go communicate with that other person and take concrete physical steps that can bring about that reconciliation. And if you decide, well, I'm just going to pray about it, well, at some point, the prayer becomes sort of an escape from that. It becomes a way of avoiding the real physical work of bringing about reconciliation. Now, it may be that before your heart is ready to do it, that you spend some time in prayer and you are preparing yourself for that time of reconciliation, okay? So I'm not saying don't pray about it. I'm just saying that you have to move from prayer towards some sort of physical action, okay? And that's a significant deal. Another thing is that it may be that there is some other discipline, some other sort of Christian practice that might be a better solution. This is kind of the second scenario, right? So, for instance, you are in a place of great anxiety, okay? And I'm going to kind of throw out a couple of different things here, but let's start with anxiety. You're in a place of great anxiety, and you're really struggling with that over and over again, okay? And it may be that prayer needs to be part of your approach to dealing with that anxiety, okay? And it may be that prayer is the bedrock, or maybe even the most important part of what it means for you to deal with that anxiety. But it might also be the case that another discipline or another practice might be a good complement to that prayer. So maybe something like the discipline of confession, or just the discipline of some other discipline of community, where you're sharing that anxiety with other people and kind of continually working through it and talking about it and thinking together about what it might mean to escape that trap of anxiety. I think that's an important deal, right? And it may be that by just only kind of approaching that problem through prayer alone, it may be that you kind of lose sight of some of those other tools that in some ways might be better able to help you move through something. Or if you're, for instance, struggling with your some sort of habit of mental or physical consumption, that it may be some place of fasting, some practice of fasting might be necessary, not just speaking only about it in prayer, but by complementing your need to exercise some sort of physical discipline with this physical component of fasting. That might be a good avenue. Or you might take something like your tiredness and your worn out and your struggle with that. And it may be that you pray about that. You pray about how worn out you feel, but you never practice anything like Sabbath, where you slow down and take space and take time. And so you see there are these times where your prayer might not be the discipline that most matches up with the sort of moment that you're having, the sort of struggle that you're having in a particular moment of your spiritual life. And so you need to think about what it means not only for you to pray, but for you to also engage in those other kinds of practices. You put yourself first a lot. You need to be praying for sure about that and what it means to humble yourself and all that. But it might mean that you also have some sort of practice of service or some sort of practice of worship, of acknowledging the needs that other people have, or your own position before God, and that those things are practices that really help you move to a place of greater and fuller humility. So, the second situation here, the first one was when you need to reconcile with someone. The second one is when some other discipline might be a better, avenue of coming to some solution. A third time it's just this as an example that might be a place where prayer alone isn't the right solution. Is when you're struggling with some sort of mental health issue, and now the anxiety stuff that I mentioned before might kind of be at that level too, or you might think of something like very acute or depression, and that's a person struggling with, and it's just not wise for someone who is struggling with something of that nature, some sort of mental health issue, and to only try to just kind of pray your way through it. You can't. It's very unwise for you to try to pray yourself through some sort of mental health issue. Okay? Now, certainly, you should be prayerful about that. You should spend time praying and speaking with the Lord about those things, just like you would any other part of your life. But there may be other concrete steps in the world that you need to take to try to seek or receive some sort of help, some sort of professional help, to help overcome that issue. Maybe some kind of engagement with a community or some kind of engagement with a particular skilled and somebody that has the kind of capacity, professional capacity to help would be useful. So you see what I mean? All three of these things, okay? These are all places where, you're not abandoning prayer in any of these situations, but neither are you only and solely relying on it. Prayer has its place in the spiritual life, and it's very much, I think, at the center of our spiritual lives. But it's not the whole thing. And if you really want to learn the art of prayer, then you can't approach it with any kind of pretense or false notion about what it really is and what it isn't. Let prayer be what it really is. And then, learn these other practices and disciplines that are a part of having a life of prayer, or part of complementing that prayer as a piece of your spiritual life. And that way, you're growing fully as a human, both as you speak to the Lord in private, in prayer, and also as you both live publicly and in community, and as you physically, engage the world around you. Okay? All right. That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening. We'll be back. We'll be back soon with a new episode. Until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you. Don't be afraid of physical action, and may your prayers move you towards those sorts of actions in the world. May the Lord be with you on each and every step of your journey. Peace.